This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, we're recapping the economic and market conditions that are impacting you and your retirement nest egg this year. Today, I'm getting out my very dim, very cloudy crystal ball, and we're looking ahead to the rest of the year, especially with regard to tariffs. Now, aside from some completely unexpected big outside shock, think like, World Trade Center attack, pandemic, those kinds of big outside shocks, those impact the markets. But barring something like that, I think 2025 is the year of the tariff. And that is the primary driver for the economy and the stock market. It's almost as if nothing else matters. Now, left alone, the economy looks poised to grow very slowly this year, probably in the 1% to 2% range. I talked about that yesterday, and depending on where you work, where you live, how much debt you have, whether or not you're trying to buy or sell a house right now, the current economic landscape, the interest rate environment, the housing issues, that's going to certainly make things feel better for you or worse for you, depending on your circumstances. But if we just look broadly at the economy, it's probably going to avoid a recession this year. And the only thing that might change that is higher tariffs than expected. And we still don't know the impacts of tariffs. There's a quote that I mentioned yesterday from JP Morgan Asset Management, and they said the inflationary impacts of tariffs have been delayed, not canceled. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Tariffs delayed, not canceled. I remember early predictions of tariffs was that by the 4th of July, the tariffs were just going to cause an absolute bloodbath in the economy. We were going to see higher prices everywhere. The economy was going to crash. And of course, that didn't happen because that was based on the original projection of tariffs and when they were going to go into effect. And that has been walked back. So again, we've had tariffs that have been delayed, not canceled. There's an interesting forecast that I read from Deloitte, and they kind of explain this in more depth. So they say the average tariff rate remains around 15% throughout the forecast period, which is basically the second half of 2025. Although certain country tariffs and certain product tariffs are expected to change. So we just had, as I'm recording this just yesterday, I was reading about a new tariff announced on copper imports. It's always changing and it's difficult to forecast when it's changing. But I think this average tariff rate of around 15% is pretty reasonable. And so you could kind of go with that assumption. Now, there's other imports like Canada and Mexico. Those are expected to fall to a very low rate. Deloitte expects them to fall to 3% by next year. There's this United States, Mexico, Canada agreement that should bring the average tariff rate down over time and into next year. However, there's a 50% expected average tariff on China and a 20% tariffs on Europe and 10% on most other countries. Let me back up because when I first mentioned the average tariff rate around 15%, I think that's the thing to keep in mind because you're going to see headlines, and unless the tariffs are broadly walked back to the largest importers into the United States, like China, Europe, they've already been walked back on Canada and Mexico. So I think the 15% average tariff rate is reasonable and something I would keep in mind, especially with the average tariff on China remaining quite high at 50%. Now, if you follow the financial news, you've probably heard of the taco trade, which is I love the acronym. I don't think it's true, though. It stands for Trump Always Chickens Out, TACO. Now, this is a way for left-leaning media and commentators to tease Trump, but I don't think it's true. It's not that he chickens out. He's just changing his mind a lot. I mentioned the new copper imports. I think I read the other day there was a new tariff announced specifically on pharmaceutical imports of like 200%. So politics aside, this uncertainty about where tariffs will actually end up is frustrating. I also believe, though, that we're not going to see the same steep declines that we saw in April after the initial tariff announcements. So the likely result is that you're going to see higher prices on many things between now and the end of the year, but perhaps not enough across the board to be felt by most Americans at the places that matter. Think the grocery store, gas station. Housing is a huge driver of inflation. And yes, you're going to have, like the copper, for example, that impacts housing prices because that is a input used to build homes. But if you're buying an expensive appliance or you need a new iPhone or some other big ticket item, I would expect those like big ticket consumer goods. I would expect to see higher prices on those things in the coming months. But it seems likely that if that current 15% average tariff rate holds, keep in mind, it's not a 15% increase on prices across the board. It's a 15% average tariffs on certain products. So I just don't think that that's going to be enough to cause a rapid increase in inflation, a significant deterioration in the economy. It'll probably lead to anemic growth in the economy for sure, but I just don't think it's enough to tip over the scale into a full-blown recession. Economy avoids a recession. Again, that's my very dim, cloudy crystal ball. And the stock market avoids further steep losses related to tariffs. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.